this was the first time that we ever used voice actors in our documentaries. I had done, prior to doing this documentary for Historical Village, and I also do documentaries for the Captiva Island Historical Society, two completely independent organizations, two different missions and so forth. But this was the first time because we used voice actors to recreate those folks who are no longer with us, because we went back into history from some of the early pioneers of Sanibel. And we got oral histories that are now, written textual oral histories that are available at the Sanibel Library. And so they were oral histories. Instead of just having one narrator do the whole thing, which usually I narrate these documentaries, we hired voice actors to recreate the voices of the people that you will hear tonight. And I was a little skeptical at first. I was guided by someone from the board of the Sanibel Library who had experience in coaching voice acting and so forth like that. And it turned out, I think you'll see, it turned out really, really, really well. So with that, is there anything else I wanted to say? All right, I'm going to show you this first clip. And one of the great things too, this does not start at the beginning of the documentary. There was a little preface that was there, about 5 minutes, and then it gets into it kind of sets the scene for what hurricanes we're going to cover. And then I'm going to take you all the way back to the Calusa period and show you how hurricanes have really shaped our islands here, even as far back as the Calusa time here in Southwest Florida. So with that, I'm going to lower the lights here. We're going to show you a clip, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to have some clips from the other hurricane, Hurricane Ian, that I want to show you. And after this first clip, we can maybe get into, if you have any questions, we'll take them then. If not, we'll wait till the end. It's totally up to you guys how you want to do this. Let's see if I can get the technology to work here.
In this program, we'll begin by exploring the pre-20th century history of how hurricanes impacted Southwest Florida. Then we'll focus on 6 specific storms. 1910, 1921, 1926, 1944, 1960, and 2004. Because the practice of naming storms in the U.S. didn't begin until the early 1950s, only 2 of these have names: Hurricane Donna in 1960 and Hurricane Charley in 2004. There were, of course, other notable wind and rain events that affected Sanibel and its neighboring communities, but these 6 were the ones most remembered by Sanibel residents because of how they brought change to the island. Of course, hurricanes played a role in shaping the island's history long before the 20th century. The Native American population, known as the Calusa, lived on the islands of Southwest Florida from about the 1st century AD to the mid-1700s. In order to adapt to the occasional tropical storms and fluctuating sea level changes of this flat landscape, this relatively sophisticated civilization created mounds or hills using shells, food scraps, debris, and dirt. The more prominent members of this society constructed large communal housing units and ceremonial buildings on top of these mounds. It's interesting to note that much of what we know today about these mounds and the Calusa is at least partially due to a hurricane.
There had been a hurricane in 1894 in late September, and it wasn't a huge storm, but it was enough to knock down trees and that sort of thing. And then right around Christmas time that same year, there was a hard freeze, which is fairly unusual. It really hit Central Florida the hardest, but it also distinctly hit this area.
In her book, Once Upon the Island Known as Sanibel, co-authored with Charles LaBeouf, Sanibel historian Betty Anholt tells the story of Smithsonian anthropologist Frank Hamilton Cushing. He led an expedition in the late 1800s to explore Southwest Florida's Calusa Mounds, which had been exposed as a result of the 1894 hurricane and a series of uncommon winter freezes. While most of his exploration was concentrated in the Marco Island area, Cushing was also attracted to the Tarpon Bay region of Sanibel because he was told that a homesteader had uncovered human remains.
Captain Sam Ellis had found some skulls when he was digging in his garden. And so he was interested, came over, and he saw a number of ridges of Indian provenance, I guess, and met with both the captain and his wife. On his way back after the dig, he also stopped a second time, and he was told of an area up at Wolford Point where he actually did do a little digging and found that below the surface there had been fortifications built.
The Cushing exploration provided the foundation for later archaeological research on Sanibel, Captiva, Usepa, and other local barrier islands throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries, research which continues today at the Randell Research Center on Pine Island. Those studies indicate that Calusa had a sometimes tolerant but occasionally violent relationship with European explorers who visited Southwest Florida waters beginning in the 1500s. British, Spanish, and French exploration would continue up until the time Florida became the U.S.'s 27th state on March 3, 1845. And hurricanes would sometimes play a role in how each of these competing sovereign states fared in the search for treasure and territory.
They were actually impacted dramatically. Many a time, Menendez, who was here in the 1560s, won a battle over the French because of a hurricane. The hurricane surprised both of them, but he was in the proper position.
In our next segment, we'll continue our journey through Sanibel's hurricane history with a look at how the early pioneers coped with storms. You'll see and hear first-person accounts of hurricane wreckage, resilience, and recovery from Sanibel residents through interviews conducted by island historians and archived at the Sanibel Library. In the more recent years, we'll have actual audio and video recordings of these residents, but in the early years where only written records are available, you'll hear their words dramatically recreated by voice actors under the direction of Jenny Darby, a board member at the Sanibel Historical Museum and Village, and a former media and theater educator. So let's get started. The year is 1910. William Howard Taft is President of the United States. The first air flight for delivering commercial freight is made between Dayton and Columbus, Ohio, by the Wright brothers and their partners. The United States Weather Bureau's Hurricane Forecasting Service in Washington, D.C. is only 12 years old and relies mainly on reports from ships at sea and Caribbean ports. With its relatively limited resources, the Bureau is tracking a somewhat mysterious storm system off the coast of Cuba, heading into the Gulf of Mexico. At first, it was thought to be two different storms, but it was later determined that it was one storm, which made a loop just off the coast of western Cuba, hit Cuba again, then headed for southwest Florida. When it left Cuba and headed for southwest Florida, it was a Category 3 storm with peak winds of 125 miles per hour and a maximum storm surge of 15 feet. Many island residents at that time said it was the worst since 1873, with houses, docks, and farmlands destroyed. This was also the first time a hurricane had hit Sanibel when it had a significant full-time population. The U.S. Census recorded 150 people living full-time in Sanibel in 1910, with another 43 in the separately designated Wolford area of Sanibel, and still another 50 on neighboring Captiva Island. Most of these residents were farmers growing citrus and winter vegetables to sell to northern markets. One indicator of how important the farming industry was to the island at that time is the fact that in 1910, they had a regional championship baseball team called the Sanibel tomato pickers, so named because the Sanibel tomato was a prized delicacy sold to many northern markets. There was also a fledgling hospitality industry fueled by wealthy northerners pursuing the region's warm winter climate and renowned sports fishing opportunities, especially tarpon. In her 1979 book, The Seashell Islands, A History of Sanibel and Captiva, author and longtime Sanibel resident Eleanor Dormer describes the night of October 17, 1910, as told to her by Captain William Haskell Reed. Reed was one of the original Sanibel homesteaders who established a family compound on the bay side of the island, near what is today the Sanibel Causeway. His son, William S. Reed, would go on to become Sanibel's postmaster for more than 40 years.
The wind had been increasing throughout the day, and by early afternoon, San Carlos Bay was a boiling pot. It was spilling over into a long line of breakers that rolled over the reed dock and crashed into the beach behind it. By 3 o'clock, the wind was howling through the coconut palms, whipping the fronds to shreds. The rain had begun to fall, and the sky took on an eerie yellow look. As the tide went out, there was another unsettling sight. Except for the channel, which ran around the end of Woodring's Point, the water had gone out of the bay and the Pine Island Sound, and one could almost have walked to St. James, which was a city across the bay on neighboring Pine Island.
Carrie Reed, seen here second from the left, was one of the daughters of Postmaster William S. Reed. She and her family were at their Sanibel home when the 1910 storm passed through. More than 80 years later, she would revisit the event during an interview with the Sanibel Historical Society as part of the Sanibel Public Library's Oral History Project.
During the 1910 hurricane, our house blew over. We had just gotten out in time when my mother, she used to preserve and make guava jelly and sea grape jelly, and then she would can the guavas, and because my dad had a beautiful sweet guava. Anyway, she had a cupboard that was just full of all fruits and juices. So when the window blew out of our house and knocked it, she had the cupboard up there by the window, and when the window blew out, it knocked the cupboard over and broke everything that she had preserved. And then we said, well, we just better get out of here now. And we hadn't gotten out of the house but just a little while before our house went down. We had all had what you call a wash house, and so we had to go out there. And then finally we couldn't stay there. The tide was rising so rapidly. So they claimed that it was blowing 110 miles an hour. And we had to go up what they call the sand flats, behind our house. In all that hurricane and water, we had to wait up there. We were soaked.
Elise Fuller was a longtime Sanibel resident whose family started visiting Southwest Florida in 1910 when she was 8 years old. That first year, they were staying in a house in Fort Myers when they decided to visit her grandfather's Gulfront house and farm on Sanibel. This photograph shows the day after the storm. The porches have been torn off the house, the roof of the barn has blown away, but fortunately the family's mule, Mamie, escaped unharmed. The tomato and pepper crops which used to be in this field were stripped clean. Elise tells the story in a 1972 interview from the Sanibel Public Library's Oral History Archives.
We arrived Friday morning. Saturday morning, the wind began to blow. It blew gently all day Saturday. Sunday morning, it was a little stronger. By Monday, it was really blowing hard, and we were all very excited because we could stand upright on the beach and lean against the wind. Finally, by Monday afternoon, we didn't dare go on the beach because the wind was so strong. By night, we had to stay in the house, and the wind was getting stronger and stronger, and the noise was getting more uproarious. Finally, the wind was so strong that my father took down the doors, the inside doors, and nailed them up against the windows. We thought it was pretty exciting, we 3 children, because we weren't told we had to go to bed. We could stay up and stay dressed, and we just sat out the night waiting to see what was going to happen. In the eye of the storm, it was very quiet. We opened the front door and looked carefully out. The front porch was gone. The furniture, which we didn't have enough sense to take in, was gone. The Gulf was up under the floorboards of the house. We could count 4 porpoises swimming around the house, but soon the wind began to blow again, and we quickly closed the door. This time the wind came from the other direction. My father took down the doors from this side of the house and nailed them up against the other side. So the night wore on, and finally, toward morning, things began to quiet down a little. As soon as it was daylight, my father got on Mamie, whose stable roof had been blown off. Mamie was up to her knees in water. My father managed to get her hitched up to the wagon, and we drove to the back porch. The back porch was gone, but he drove up to the back door, and we all jumped in and started out for the lighthouse. As the water receded, other people came up to the lighthouse too, including one man who was all dripping blood. He had spent the night in a tree. Other creatures came up, including a deer, a white-tailed deer, the only deer I have ever seen on the island.
The Woodrings were another homesteading family who suffered through the 1910 storm. In this picture, you see Sam Woodring Sr., his wife Anna, and their daughter Flora. In 1910, Flora was a 21-year-old woman at home with her sister-in-law, taking care of 2 nieces.
Well, I remember my mother was in Pennsylvania visiting, and I went down to the post office that morning. And it was quite rough and windy, boats having a bad time to land. And by night there wasn't any water, scarcely in the San Carlos Bay, from our house to St. James City. So I said, Aurora, this is really getting bad. The new clubhouse owned by the McCulloughs had been built. My brother-in-law had built it. It was sort of a group to provide a club for sports fishing. That house was up so high that I could walk under it. I said, Aurora, we better get out of here, but we're going to have to put something over the children's faces because the wind and the sand will sting and the wind will take their breath away. So I took the larger child and she took the smaller one, and we fought our way over there to the clubhouse. We were just in one room, the back room where the shed was, on the back side. Wow, it poured in. Everything was wet. So just about 12 o'clock, I imagine, there was a lull and a perfectly beautiful moonlit night. And I looked at the back door and I happened to look down and I saw the water boil up. And I tell you something, that porch was, 14 feet wide, 14 or 15. And the waves were pounding up on there and sloshing over the doorway and into that big living room in just a few minutes. Absolutely no one on this earth could have gone to us. No one. And I tell you, all that water that had been held back out into the Gulf and all came surging in. And I guess that's when our house went down. But the McCullough place stood.
Another member of a late 1800s homesteading family told the story of the 1910 hurricane in this 1969 article from the Sanibel Captiva Islander newspaper. Art Gibson's family was part of that farming community in the early 1900s, but as an adult took on work with the Mackenzie Brothers steamer operation that transported passengers, mail, and supplies from the mainland to Sanibel and Captiva. He was working one of those boats in October of 1910 when the storm approached.
We left Fort Myers at 6 o'clock. We were supposed to leave at 6 o'clock and go down to Captiva and make all these different stops, transfer the mails, and go back to Fort Myers the same evening, get back about 5 o'clock. That was our schedule. Well, we started out, made all our landings down, but it was getting rougher and rougher. At that time, we didn't know what a hurricane was. I had no weather reports, no weather bureau, no hurricane warnings or anything. You just took it as it came. So it kept getting worse and worse. We made it on to Captiva and back as far as Wolford. We made it that far back and it got so bad we had to tie up there and spend the rest of the hurricane. Our boat wrecked, went ashore, sunk, scattered the mail and everything else all along. The mail was in heavy canvas bags, and they were all over the beach. As soon as the hurricane began to pass on by and the weather got better, we began to get to work on the boat. As soon as the tide went out and the daylight came, we got back to Fort Myers the next day with that boat and all the mail at 20 after 6 the next evening. We decided that that's the worst one, I concluded, that it was the worst one that has been here, and I still think it was.
One final story from the 1910 hurricane comes from Belton Johnson, seen here as a young man working in the farm fields of Sanibel. Belton's father was one of the early farmers on the island who prospered at the beginning of the 20th century. But that would change with the 1910 storm.
Well, the 1910 hurricane put Papa out of business. He had 125 acres of vegetables he lost in that hurricane, and that's the hardest hurricane I ever seen. It blew down a lot of these cabbage palms. There was quite a lot of water, but it was rainwater. It tore up Papa's hay shed and blew some of those heavy timbers quite a distance. A lot of hurricanes, I think most hurricanes, have small tornadoes in them. People don't realize that.
Sanibel's farmers were hard hit by the 1910 hurricane, but many replanted and persevered. However, big changes would come with the next set of storms, which we'll talk about in our next segment. But one other note before we leave 1910. One of the early Sanibel homesteaders was the Reverend George Barnes, a Kentucky evangelist who was retiring from a lifetime of missionary work in India and other parts of the world. He and his wife and children established the Sisters Hotel on their Gulfront homesteaded property, and it would go on to become what we know today as the Casa Ibel Resort. The Reverend Barnes built Sanibel's first church on his homesteaded property in 1894. It was called the Church of the Four Gospels. It provided a place of worship for the island's small population of residents and for visiting boaters and fishermen. After more than a decade and a half of service, the church was destroyed by the 1910 hurricane. 7 years after that storm, the Sanibel Community Church was built, and some of the surviving pews from Church of the Four Gospels were donated to it. Those pews still exist today in the historic section of the Sanibel Community Church on Periwinkle Way. The next two significant hurricanes to affect Sanibel would come within 5 years of each other in what came to be known as the Roaring Twenties. It started as a decade of post-World War I economic prosperity, epitomized by dramatic changes in music and fashion, as well as large-scale development of automobiles, telephones, movies, radio, and electrical appliances. Standard Oil tycoon Henry Flagler's development of hotels and railroads along the east coast of Florida helped fuel a 1920s Florida land boom that was also felt in southwest Florida. Fort Myers Beach resident James Newton's Edison Park near Thomas Edison's Fort Myers estate was one of many master-planned residential communities going up in the Fort Myers area. Developer W.E. Cogdell was placing ads in numerous newspapers touting what he called the most beautiful subdivisions in Florida he was developing on Sanibel. For a while, he even had his own ferry service from Ponderosa to Sanibel. These were the national and regional settings for two storms in 1921 and 1926, which would help accelerate the change of Sanibel's economy from agriculture to tourism, hospitality, and real estate. The track of the 1921 hurricane took it directly from the Gulf of Mexico into the Tampa area, and its 100-mile-per-hour winds and 10.5-foot storm surge caused extensive damage there. It was the highest storm surge for the Tampa area since 1848, but the east side of the storm skirted Sanibel and Captiva, and rising tides created a lot of problems here as well. In fact, the storm actually divided Captiva into two separate islands by carving out a new channel, which came to be known as Redfish Pass. Belton Johnson had moved on from farming to fishing by this time, and he related his memories of the creation of Redfish Pass in this 1976 interview with Gloria Berry.
People farmed, and Jesse Carter and his three brothers had a grove over there where Redfish Pass is. And when the 21 hurricane washed that out, now all the people in Fort Myers refer to it as the 26 hurricane that washed the pass through. But it was 1921. I fished in Redfish Pass in 1925, and so it was 21. But it didn't cut out and make a big pass overnight. It was 3 or 4 years to make it large enough to stay open.
The 1926 hurricane would further widen Redfish Pass into the passage that we know today just north of South Seas Island Resort. This 1926 Category 4 storm came out of the Atlantic and hit Miami first. Then its powerful winds traveled across the state and into southwest Florida. This came to be known as the Great Miami Hurricane because the 13-foot storm surges and 138-mile-per-hour winds would cause more than 240 deaths and damages exceeding $2 billion in today's money. Most of the major death and destruction was in the Miami area, but Sanibel and Captiva would suffer as well. Both the 1921 and 1926 storms would create major changes for these islands. Saltwater intrusion from the storm surge in 1921 hurt the farmers, who were already feeling the effects of competition from mainland farms, who could now use the emerging railroad systems to transport their fruits and vegetables to northern markets. For Belton Johnson and his father, the 21 storm was the beginning of the end for their time as farmers.
Well, I didn't leave the island entirely. I went back to Fort Myers and ran an engine on a freight boat. And then I come back here and started dragging. But I farmed 1 year after I come back. That was the year 1921. I lost everything I had put into it. That was the one where it covered the island. Saltwater covered the island so bad. After the 21 hurricane, people, a lot of them moved off islands to Iona, and they started farming over there.
It was in this same year, 1921, that the Gavin family moved to Sanibel. The Gavins were among several African-American families that lived and worked on the island in its early years, and their descendants continue to have businesses here today. Isaiah Gavin and his wife Hannah lived in a house with their 4 children that was close to the land Isaiah worked as a tomato farmer. One of those children, Oscar Gavin, was interviewed by historian Eleanor Dormer in 1980. He told the tale of having to evacuate the family home and being taken in by the Nutt family, homesteaders who had built a 3-story home on the island known as Gray Gables.
And so then come the storm in 21 in October. In that storm, we had to get up before day in the morning, I reckon about 4 o'clock, and walk over to the Gables, and they let us upstairs. And the water came up to the top step of the 2nd floor.
How many feet would you say that was?
Every bit of 10 feet. That was a lot of water. And all downstairs was the kitchen, the stoves, wood-burning stoves, and dining room on the left, kitchen over here on the right. That storm just floated all the food down over on the floor. So my dad went down, swum around, he got some grits and cans and things, and he brought up a little at a time, and later found some canned beef and such as that. And so Miss Cordian then cooked it all up together and, made a mush, and so we ate.
Well, would your labels be off them?
Yes, ma'am.
So you wouldn't know what you were getting?
Well, the cans was square, corned beef and such as that.
That's right. They did have square corners, didn't they? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
What about the garden?
The gardens were all destroyed, and nice tomatoes were ready to pick.
What happened afterwards? Did you stay on the island?
We stayed. We didn't go nowhere.
Now, this was 1921.
1921.
Despite the damage to crops from the 1921 storm, farming did continue on Sanibel and Captiva, but it became increasingly apparent that land was going to be more valuable for real estate than for farming, and smaller farms were having a tough time competing with the larger farms. On Captiva, the homesteading Bryant and Carter families sold their farmland to Clarence Chadwick for pennies on the dollar. Chadwick had made a fortune with the invention of a forgery-resistant printing process for business checks and moved from Nebraska to Captiva in hopes the warmer climate would ease his painful arthritis. He continued the farming presence of the lands he purchased on Captiva and in the Wolford area of Sanibel by establishing one of the nation's largest key lime plantations. But in later years, as the islands evolved from farming to hospitality, his land would be used by his family and other owners as a fish camp for wealthy fishing enthusiasts. Today, we know the property where Chadwick's Captiva key lime plantation existed as South Seas Island Resort.
Okay, well, that's what I'm going to show you from